CBC has obtained documents that show public colleges and universities are driving the rapid increase in international students across the country. The documents call into questions made by both federal and provincial politicians who have blamed bad actors among private colleges for the international student spike. The CBC's Mike Crawley dug into the documents and he joins me now from Toronto. So Mike, tell us more about what you found.
Yeah, so David worked on this story with my CBC colleague Valerie Ouellette. We obtained this stuff through access to information. And these stats, David, have never before been made fully available to the public. What they do is they count exactly how many study permits were granted to international students to attend each and every one of the colleges and universities across Canada for every year since 2018. And so what this does is it really gives us the fullest picture we've ever had of exactly where the growth in international students has been happening. Big numbers overall. We're talking more than 1.5 million study permits issued over the past 6 years, and that means foreign students have brought in, we're talking tens of billions of dollars into Canada's post-secondary schools. But it's not been the same all the way across the country. So take a look at this graphic. Back in 2018, you had about 90,000 international students who got permits to attend a college or a university in Ontario. Pretty comparable numbers with the rest of Canada, even though Ontario's population is 40% of the country. But then when you go to last year, Ontario's numbers soar to nearly 240,000, far more than every other province combined.
Right. That is interesting. So I saw that, and there's other graphs in your online story which really show the spike by institution and different things. So what was behind this rapid increase in the number of student permits?
Yeah, so there's what the politicians and the colleges say was actually behind the increase and what you can surmise. Look, all of this money, the extra fees that international students bring in, that was being paid to colleges and universities at a time when provincial governments were really imposing pretty severe restraint on this sector. So it was a source of revenue to supplement inadequate provincial government funding. But colleges also pointed out that, in fact, they were doing, by recruiting these international students, they were doing exactly what both provincial and federal governments were asking them to do, which was bring in these international students to fill the jobs of the future. We need skilled workers to fill all of these gaps in the labor force. So deliberate policy. And our Catherine Cullen pointed this out today in a scrum with the Immigration Minister, Mark Miller. Take a listen to that.
What responsibility does the government bear in this?
Well, look, we all have our share of responsibility, but there's a bit of, colleges are coming in and pleading excellence. They're now pleading innocence. They're now at the next step in looking at how they actually need to reform and get their own ships in order. If you look at some of the stats, only 2% of the permits were going into nursing. They're going into other fields that are not exactly connected to the area of study. That's not an education system that the International Visa Program is intended to support.
So a few interesting things in there. I mean, clearly he was, the minister was thrown off balance a little bit by that question. But pointing out here that there seemed to be a bit of a mismatch between this idea that we're bringing in and training these folks for the jobs that are needed with the system for actually going and approving these permits. Remember, it wasn't the colleges or the universities that approve the permits, it's the feds that had the responsibility for that. And so clearly the control over, why should this person be granted a permit to come and study at this particular program at a college wasn't really happening. So now, of course, the minister has cut dramatically the number of permits that are going to be granted this year. And what that is doing is it's leaving the provinces and the colleges scrambling to try to figure out what are they going to do to make up for this dramatic loss of revenue. And we've been asking those questions here in Ontario and haven't really been able to get any clear answer from the province.
No, it's a big challenge for the whole post-secondary education sector. All right, Mike, great stuff. That's the CBC's Mike Crawley in Toronto. And this drop in student permits is only one issue that is being faced by Ontario colleges and universities. I'm joined now by Alex Usher, President of Higher Education Strategy Associates. Alex, it's good to speak with you. I just wonder if we can start with your reaction to what we just heard there from Mike, that we had this big surge in international permits going into Ontario. Yes, the feds were signing off on it, but they argue they weren't necessarily going. to places that the industry is now saying they were intended to go. What do you make of these findings?
Oh, the findings are absolutely correct. I think, the interpretation you have about whose fault that whole surge is, that's up for discussion. I don't think the federal government has ever had the responsibility for deciding where students should go within Canada. That's a power that effectively the minister took over for the first time about 4 or 5 weeks ago. Until that, the assumption was always that provinces controlled institutions, and therefore it was their responsibility to say yes or no to students coming in, and to designating which institutions they were going to. I mean, I think what caught everybody by surprise was the fact that what are called designated learning institutions, that is an institution which is capable of accepting international students, that those were handed out so freely to institutions with very little political or very little policy oversight.
Right, and I remember talking to Mark Miller about this when he announced it at the cabinet retreat in Montreal, and essentially no international students came in because of COVID, and then there was a surge to sort of catch up because of those delays, but then it just kept going, and a lot of it was going to institutions. Like the bulk would go to public sector institutions, but there's a rigor to the programs there and to the academic standards, and the private sector, who knows, in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, is essentially their argument.
Right, and confusing things is the fact that a lot of Ontario colleges were using private partners to bring students in. So every institution that wasn't in the GTA was allowed to have a private partner in the GTA that could accept up to 7,500 students a year. And that's what caused the huge boom in the last 2 years. There were basically 100,000 students who were theoretically going to places like, Niagara or Northern College and Timmins or Confederation College in Thunder Bay, but were actually attending school in the GTA. And so that dumped about 100,000 new international students into the GTA, and that helped to overheat the housing market here.
Okay, so now this corrective move by the federal government, this is going to be a revenue hit for a lot of post-secondary institutions, and for the public sector in particular. This comes after the tuition cut and granting freeze that was imposed by the Ford government about 5 years ago. They were able to survive within that sort of financing structure because of Bill 124 putting cost constraints and wage constraints in the system. Now that's gone out the window. And now the international students who brought in all this extra revenue is in rapid decline. We saw some extra money from the Ontario government yesterday. You don't think it's enough. Where is the Ontario post-secondary education system right now after all of these things have been stacked on top of each other?
So the hit from international students in Ontario, I think optimistically, it's about a $1.8 billion hit. Pessimistically, it's somewhere between $2.5 and $3 billion, mostly concentrated in the college sector. On the other stuff, I think as the Blue Ribbon panel on post-secondary financing pointed out, in real dollars, public funding is down about 28% to universities and colleges over 10 years. The value of tuition fees has gone down 25% over 5 years. These are huge numbers. What the provincial government did yesterday was it gave half of what the Blue Ribbon panel suggested, and of course the Blue Ribbon panel was issued before all this international stuff comes about. So when I look at what I think the hit is going to be to public institutions, the provincial package is probably going to cover about 20% of that. So the other 80% institutions are going to have to deal with on their own. They can't go to they can't raise domestic tuition fees. They've got no extra domestic money to go to. So you're probably looking at a cut to the system of between 8 and 10%. It's about $2 billion.
Okay, so what do you mean by that, a cut to the system of 8 to 10%? I mean, are we talking about program closures? Are we talking about faculty layoffs? What are we talking about there?
Right. And we don't know because we don't know how the money is going to get distributed. I mean, in some ways, costs will go down too because there will be fewer international students to teach, right? So in some ways, it balances off. It's not going to be $2 billion plus the same number of students. I think what you're going to see is campus closures when it comes to these public-private partnerships. I think a lot of those will go under by the end of the year, and so that's a lot of jobs and a lot of students in different parts of the GTA. I think places like Conestoga, which opened 4 or 5 new campuses in the last 2 years, a couple of those are going to close. They're not going to have enough students for that. In other places, yeah, you're just going to see slow cutbacks. I think, people talked about the difficulty that places like Queens and Guelph are having, which are, in the tens of millions in deficit right now. This is going to make it harder for them to come back. And so I think what you'll see in those places is you will see a decline in services. You will see a growth in class size. It's not going to result in closure of any universities. I don't think we're going to have another Laurentian, but we might in the college sector. I think some of those northern colleges are in real trouble. So places like Northern, places like Canadore, it's not clear to me how they're going to be able to offer anywhere near as many programs as they have been in the last years, because they've been using the profits from these international students to fund their core mission.
Well, you mentioned Conestoga, and you look at the numbers that Mike and his team pulled together, 6,000 international student permits like 5 years ago, 31,000 last year. Just an explosion of growth. And colleges, unlike universities, don't have residences necessarily, and the housing supports that you see, even though that's still lacking in the university sector, that sort of speaks to the problem there. But you mentioned Queens, you mentioned Guelph. There's 10 or so universities in Ontario, maybe more, that are looking at deficits. We've seen Queens drawing down on its endowment. We've seen places like York, almost half of their revenue comes from international students. I mean, what's the sort of vulnerability for the university sector in this? The colleges, that's the numbers kind of speaks to it. Universities is a little bit harder to get a handle on because of tenure and faculty. Where do you think they're headed?
Well, there's more of their revenue is protected because master's and PhD students are outside the cap.
Right.
And so at a lot of universities, something like half the students, in theory at least, are outside the cap. I think it's the ones where you've got a lot of international students at the undergraduate level. So places like Algoma, I think that will their big expansion in Brantford is under threat. But when you're talking about losing, like, I don't think there's any university in the province that's going to see a reduction in revenue of less than about 5%. So you're talking about 5% cuts across the board in these institutions. Like I say, I don't think many will resort to program closures. I don't think the hit is quite big enough to get them to start doing that. But you're going to see hiring freezes. Like I say, you're going to see reduction in services. I don't think there's any way around that with a reduction in revenue this big.
And just as a final point, Alex Usher, what we saw from the Ford government yesterday was sort of half of what the Blue Ribbon panel said is needed. And as you say, that predates what happened here with the foreign student cap. Right. What do you anticipate the Ontario government to do? Do you think they've done their response and now they're just going to count on the sector to figure it out from here and make some tough choices?
Yes.
Okay.
This is a government that I think when it comes to the education file, this is a government that likes to be seen to do things rather than to actually do things. This was probably the minimum they thought they could get away with. It's not, what they offered was not a real solution to the problem. What they're really saying is they're going to cover inflation for the next 3 years. They're not going to do much more than that. And so does it make up for I saw the minister saying, hey, this is the biggest announcement for the last 10 years. And I thought, well, yeah, that's because the last 10 years have been terrible. That's a really low bar to compare yourself against. So I think the government knows that what they're doing is at best a Band-Aid.
Right.
And that's fine with them. They've never particularly liked universities to begin with. There's a whole bunch of culture war reasons why they dislike those institutions. And sector's on its own. Nobody's coming to the rescue.
Alex Usher, we appreciate you taking the time today. It's Alex Usher, President of Higher Education Strategy Associates. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.